Good morning. My name is Professor Gary Scudder. I teach at Champlain College in the U.S., and today I want to give a brief presentation of an article that I've also produced for the conference um, on two related texts. One very, very famous and one essentially anonymous. The famous one is the Book of Disquiet, one of the most famous novels of the 20th century. The second is a very short piece, actually only 4 pages long, entitled Letter from a Hunchback to a Metalworker. Um, they have several things in common. The most obvious is that they're both associated with Fernando Pessoa, the famous and mysterious, actually very mysterious Portuguese author who died in 1935, living most of his life in Lisbon. The Book of Disquiet is one of the most acclaimed novels of the 20th century. The second is the shorter piece, the letter from a hunchback to a metalworker, is a 4 page love letter that is never sent from a 19-year-old hunchback girl with tuberculosis to a boy that she sees in the street. And she writes him a letter but never sends it. So one is very famous, one is not very famous. Um, they're both associated with Fernando Pessoa. Um, the other thing they have in common is they're both told through the lens of heteronyms. Heteronyms are associated very much with Fernando Pessoa. They're not pseudonyms. Fernando Pessoa would say that a pseudonym is essentially just an author writing in his own voice through another name, where heteronym has much more freedom to go much further afield. There's like pseudonyms on steroids. They have their own life to live. And depending upon how you count it, Pessoa created probably over 100 heteronyms in his life. And it's sometimes said that the foremost famous and brilliant Portuguese poets of the 20th century are all Fernando Pessoa, writing under different heteronyms. The heteronym for the Book of Disquiet is Bernardo Suarez, who was a middle-aged bookkeeper at Vasquez and Company, who we're told in the story gives this book to Fernando Pessoa and asks him to publish it. It's called a factless autobiography, because essentially it's Fernando Pessoa writing through Bernardo Suarez, uh, which essentially frees Fernando Pessoa from the tyranny of names and dates and events and places, so he can go much deeper. The heteronym for the short piece is again Maria Jose, this 19-year-old girl with a hunchback and tuberculosis who's dying. She's Of the heteronym, she's famous mainly because she is, well, for two reasons. One is because she's the last heteronym. After her, there are no more heteronyms created. She is born a couple years before Pessoa passes away. She's also the only female heteronym. So most of the work on the letter have focused on either that it's the terminal effort of the heteronyms or the gender aspect of it, which gives you an avenue into Pessoa. However, I think there's other things going on which make it even more interesting. And what I want to talk about for the rest of this time, our time together, is its similarity, I would argue, to the Book of Disquiet, the much more famous Book of Disquiet. And I think they're similar for several reasons. Um, One is how the two characters, who seemingly on the surface have nothing in common with each other, actually have a lot in common between the middle-aged bookkeeper and a 19-year-old girl. First is they describe themselves as nobody or nothing. And they're very clear about this. And if you think about their role as a heteronym, that is a fictitious character, although Fernando Pessoa would probably not say they were fictitious, you can see the similarity. Secondly, they have very interesting origin stories, if you want to use that clumsy term. In the Book of Disquiet, again, Fernando Pessoa is at a cafe. He keeps running into this guy every night. They nod as you would in a cafe. But one day a fight breaks out in the street, and both of them are drawn to the window to look outside, and they begin talking, and this is the beginning of their relationship. So hence, an important internal phenomenon is brought about in response to external turmoil. Something very similar happens in this short letter of Maria Jose. She writes in the letter, again, that she writes to Antonio but never sends. She writes, quote, "One morning when you were on your way to the metalworks, a cat was scuffling with a dog across the street from my window, and we were all watching. And you stopped to watch too, in front of the barber shop. And you suddenly looked up at my window and saw me laughing, and you laughed too. And that's the only time we were ever alone together, so to speak, or as alone together as I could ever hope for," end quote. So what you have here then is another instance where an external phenomenon brings about an internal phenomenon. Another similarity, in building on this one, is the fact that so much of the action takes place in both stories at a window. Pessoa famously in the Book of Disquiet wrote, quote, "There's a thin sheet of glass between me and life. However clearly I see and understand life, I can't touch it," end quote. With that in mind, then, the character Bernardo Suarez in the story is often viewing life through a window. And there's so many examples, I don't have time to talk about all of them. But here's one, end quote. "At this very moment, idle and alone in the office," again, Bernardo Suarez is a bookkeeper, "because everyone else went to lunch, I'm staring through the grimy window at an old man who's slowly teetering down the other side of the street. He's not drunk, he's dreaming." Dreaming is very important to Pessoa. He's attentive to what doesn't exist, end quote. So again, he's always at a window, always looking outside, never going outside. The same thing with the Maria Jose letter. Obviously, she's a hunchback. She doesn't walk very well. She doesn't really get to go outside. She's sickly. So everything happens at the window. For instance, she says, quote, "Antonio, I wish you'd think for a minute of how sad it is to be a hunchback who always sits next to the window," end quote. Or, "But I never get what I want. That's how I was born. And I even have to have a kind of platform beneath my chair to be able to see out of the window," end quote. Or, "All day long I sit at the window and see people go back and forth, fast or slow, talking to this person or that person, enjoying life, and I'm just a flower pot with a withered plant forgotten in the window, waiting to be taken away," end quote. That's a beautiful and painful line. So you have the same sort of sense. But someone never uses a door as a metaphor, because a door would be you get to go out into the world. It's always the window. So you get light or some flawed, minimal version of reality coming into your life. Another similarity, I think what it represents, this whole thing, think of the liminality space of the window, is this sense of alienation, that both of them feel cut off from the world in some essential way. And because of this, one thing that you'll see with both of them is almost creating a dialogue with the people they see outside, because they can't touch them. They have no contact with them. And so you get these lovely things, like, for instance, in one of the more fanciful passages in the Book of Disquiet, Pessoa is thinking about a Japanese teacup of his, which is broken. He writes, quote, "When one of my Japanese teacups is broken, I imagined the real cause was not the careless hand of a maid, but the anxieties of the figures inhabiting the curves of that porcelain. Their grim determination to commit suicide doesn't shock me. They use the maid as one of us might use a gun," end quote. Very funny and fanciful, but it's about him placing, essentially creating a reality in characters that he can't see or touch, or in this case, who don't really exist. Same thing happens in the letter from Maria Jose. She looks outside and talks about, in her letter, what people do when some are ministers who go back and forth in this country and that country. Others are in high society and marry, go to baptisms, get sick, and are operated on by the same doctors. Others have houses here, houses there. Others steal. Others bring charges. Some commit terrible crimes, and goes on and on and on. So she's creating a reality that she can't exist. The final similarity is that this alienation, I think, goes two ways, as you would expect from a window, in that part of it is imposed upon the world outside of them, but part of it's also is intentional, is to not be a part of that world. For instance, when you think about Pessoa, I mean, he's always creating these boundaries. He doesn't want to have that world. He says at one point, if our lives were an eternal standing by the window, if we could remain there forever, like hovering smoke, with the same moment of twilight forever painting the curve of the hills, if we could remain that way for beyond forever. So he wants to be alienated. If you think about the notion of a heteronym, I mean, if you're creating heteronyms, you're actually creating something to protect yourself, right? To reinforce this alienation. And thinking about Maria Jose, I mean, what better heteronym that would act as a barrier than a dying 19-year-old girl? And even she herself, Maria Jose, that is Fernando Pessoa writing as Maria, even she is both a victim of alienation and creates alienation. Because think about it, in the end, she writes the letter, but she doesn't send it. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you get a chance to look at the article. All my best. Bye.